And welcome back. We are on week 6 of SED 445. We're going to talk a little bit today about data collection and behavior monitoring. We're going to focus most of our attention on quantitative data collection. Worksheet 2 is quantifiable data. So we're going to focus a lot of today on talking about quantitative methods. So we look at the data collection methods. There are many, many more quantitative data collection methods, but for the purpose of this class, we're going to be focusing on these few. So we have frequency, also known as event recording. So from this, we can also derive rate. Frequency can be taken in whole or continuous recording or partial interval, which we'll get to in a little bit, or momentary time sampling. We could also use duration. So that's for how long does a behavior occur. There's also latency, which means how long did it take after a prompt or a stimulus. And then there's also permanent products, such as work samples that we're not going to use so much. So over on the other side, we look at, some qualitative methods, which are, comparing age appropriateness or type of behavior. But then there's also intensity, which could fall under both qualitative or quantitative methods. It's not recommended without some form of validated tool. So we're not going to use intensity qualitative methods. Intensity could be qualitative or quantitative. So when we go to summarize the data, we have a few different ways we could do this. We could use raw scores, so number of times or length of time. So for instance, the behavior happened 3 times, okay? That's pretty easy. We could also use percentages, and to do this, you divide the total number of opportunities by total number of times the behavior occurred. So say the behavior occurred 3 times, so you divide that by the total number of opportunities. We'll just say there were 4 opportunities. So you divide the total number of minutes observed by total number of minutes observed that the behavior occurred. So that would be 0.75. Then you multiply by 100 to get the percent. So you take that decimal and you multiply by 100 to get the percent. So 75%. Then we look at rate. So that is the number of times on average. So you divide the total number of minutes observed by the total number of times the behavior observed. So for this one, you do not multiply by 100. So for your IBCB worksheet 2, you're going to summarize by way of a chart and also as a narrative. So percentages can also, just word of caution, be frequently misinterpreted or miscalculated. So you want to be really, really clear on what you used to get that percentage. So we're going to talk a little bit about continuous versus interval versus momentary time samples. So you measure the behavior continuously whenever possible. This provides more data than interval, so there's more confidence that the data is reliable. But you also need to consider whether you're able to monitor a behavior and teach at the same time, and a lot of us just can't. So you use interval if you need to stop teaching and do nothing but watch the target student for the target behavior for that short amount of time. Continuous data collection, the behavior is monitored as long as it occurs, and the teacher is present to record it. It's used with behaviors which can be monitored without interfering with the teacher's instruction, and it's most reliable method because it yields the greatest amount of data. However, it's challenging to watch just one student when you have a class of, say, 30. So this may not be the best fit for you for time sampling. You also could use interval time samples. So that's where you observe the student for a certain interval of time and use intervals as a tally or frequency. There's also momentary time sampling, which means you set a timer. So every 5 minutes, you get a timer that goes off and you glance at the student and you either observe the behavior or you don't. And so this is best used for behaviors that are quiet or last for a long time. So for example, a student falling asleep in class, when you're wanting to collect data on that, um, you are, it's not going to interfere with anything. Just a word of caution for this. If you do choose to have some sort of timer or something, just don't make it obvious to the student. I think we can kind of figure out ways to make it not obvious, put it on vibrate or something. So now we're going to get into monitoring behavior, and it's continuous or high frequency behavior that is too challenging to record with frequency recording. You use interval. Is it discrete with an observable beginning and ending? Not too fast or too often to be counted? Does it occur briefly? You would use frequency recording. So same as the interval, but more user-friendly for teachers because it does not require extended period of observation. With data recording, you might use time sampling. Length of time, duration. How long does it take for behavior to begin? Latency. So that's just a quick review for us there. Frequency, duration, and latency. So frequency, also known as event recording, how often the behavior occurs. So it's usually collected on behaviors that don't last long and do occur frequently and have readily observable beginning and ending. So for example, hitting. These are good. It's also for good for discrete behaviors. So duration, how long the behavior lasts. So usually it's collected on behaviors that last a long time or occur fast and are frequently that they don't have readily observable beginning and ending time. So an example there would be body rocking or some sort of self-stimulation. There's also latency recording, so how much time passes between two events. So typically the two events are a prompt or some sort of stimuli, and when the student begins to comply with the prompt, that's the most frequently used. For some behaviors, though, you would use latency or duration collection methods, like for, say, laying on the floor. So you got to be really picky with how you're going to collect the data, because if you were to use frequency recording for tantruming, it's not very descriptive. So if you said, okay, so he had 4 tantrums today. Okay, so over a 6-hour day, that doesn't seem like too bad. But if you were to use duration, okay, so he had 4 1-hour tantrums today, that kind of hits home a little bit more. That gives us a little bit more information that we can use. Interval data collection is a form of frequency recording. So this is used when monitoring student behavior that's continuous or high frequency or does not easily come to the teacher's attention, so that it is difficult or impossible to monitor the behavior and teach at the same time. So for instance, out of seat, talking to peers, sucking on thumb, that is something that's continuous or high frequency. So you can accomplish this by monitoring the student at a predetermined interval. So generally intervals should not be longer than 30 seconds. A partial interval is where you record whether the behavior occurred at any time during the interval. So even if it's for a second, you would still say, yep, it happened. A whole interval is where you record only for occurrences that the target behavior lasts throughout the whole interval, so for that 30 seconds. So generally speaking, it's a form of frequency recording interval, but it could also be done with latency or duration, but it would be very difficult to do. So have the non-example available. So what is happening if the behavior is not occurring? Have that kind of defined on when you're doing this. Time sampling is a variation of interval recording, and this is when you record whether the target behavior is occurring at the end of each interval. Even more user-friendly for teachers because it doesn't require extended periods of observation with continuous data recording, but There is a sacrifice insofar as accuracy because target may be under or over reported. So that's really up to you to decide if you're going to use time sampling. So let's look at interval versus momentary time sampling. So you use interval if you need to or can stop teaching and can do nothing but watch the target behavior for the target behavior. You would use interval to observe the student for a certain interval of time and use intervals as tallies or frequencies. Momentary time sampling would be every however many minutes you glance at the student to observe their behavior. So you measure behaviors continuously whenever you can, whenever it's possible, but it provides more because it provides more data than interval, so it's more confidence that data is reliable. But consider whether you're able to monitor a behavior and teach at the same time. So you have to kind of gauge what kind of interval or momentary time sampling you can use and what's feasible for you within the classroom and adapt it. Sometimes these data collection, it takes time to figure out what is going to work for you as a teacher. You might want to play around with different kinds of worksheets, whether, I usually will recommend, just quick tally marks for things instead of a teacher sitting and writing a little narrative every time a behavior happens. So you're going to have to adapt it to what your classroom environment looks like, what the behaviors look like. So you have to take all that in consideration when you are selecting a data collection method. So again, I hope this was helpful as we pursue our IBCB worksheet 2, where you're going to focus on a lot of data collection methods. Thank you for watching, and feel free to shoot me some questions on our Questions for Liz forum if you need any more clarification or if you have any questions. All right, I'll see you on the boards.